I wanted to do a bit of a paint along, and I'm going to be painting a ripped off head. If you've been watching this channel before, thanks. And you'll probably recognize this orc. It's got a ripped off head. And I've been asked how it was painted, so this is just going to be how I painted this ripped off head. Kind of a video. My thoughts, just initially, before I painted it, was obviously it's been ripped off. I think the person was actually dead before it got ripped off. And so we're going not sort of zombie land, but you know, it's not a fresh head. It's an old head, and I want it to be bruised, and I want it to be sort of messy. I mean, imagine for one thing you get killed probably by an orc, and then it rips your head off. I mean, I get a bruise from just sort of accidentally walking into a table. Can you imagine the kind of bruising you get when your head gets ripped off? And so that's sort of what I'm going for. I started out with Resurrection Flesh from Scale Colors game and fantasy range. But, you know, after the first sort of layer, it's been watered down a little bit. I realized it was a bit too bright, a bit too sort of pink. And so I added a little bit of flat earth from Vallejo's model range into that, just making it a little bit more brown, a little bit more sort of chocolatey, and covered the whole thing with that. Next up, I mixed in a little bit of heavy red from Vallejo as well, from their game color range. And I painted this pretty much everywhere that isn't a highlight. Trying to remember, because this was zenithal primed from the start, and I'm still trying to keep that in mind. So I'm sort of painting this to darken down wherever the zenithal priming was darker. Also adding sort of a bit of a sort of bruised red kind of a look. Next up is actually adding the bruising. And I've got these Bloodfest Crimson and Braineather Azure. Also from the fantasy and game range from Scale Color. These all come out of a set. It's called Unnatural Flesh, which is pretty much, you know, we're not doing unnatural, but, you know, the theme is dead, yeah? So the Bloodfest Crimson I paint where I would imagine there would have been blood. I'm thinking it's already dried a little bit, but it's coming out of the eyes, pouring down along the nose. It's coming out of the ears. It's sort of from wherever he would have been ripped off, out of the mouth. I'm thinking, you know, either if he died first or if he just got his head ripped off, there would have been blood involved, yeah? And then the Braineather Azure is like, I imagine bruising. A lot of bruising would be happening when you meet an orc. So there's, you know, all around the neck, all along, you know, and it also acts sort of like a shade. I increase the shadows with this, so I use a lot more of it in the shadowed areas than in the brighter ones. I'm leaving pretty much all the highlights alone. Now this is a process that you could keep on going sort of really detailed, or just sort of, you know, just slop it on. I'm sort of somewhere in between. But I try and, I mean, these two paints are adding effects, but I try and, I mean, both of them are darker than the brightest skin, so I also use them as a shade. So, as I said, wherever the zenithal priming is darker, by the way, I should have said this from the start, if you wish, you can, you know, if you zenithal prime, which this was, which is, you know, great. I made a video about, you know, why you should or shouldn't zenithal prime. But basically, if you zenithal prime, you can take a picture with your phone and you can sort of reference it later so that you can see, okay, it's supposed to be a bit darker. And, you know, in this case, you can choose, should it be bloody or should it be bruised? After that, I just go in and paint the teeth and the eyes with a white. This is Game Colors off-white. Basically, I mean, I'm not going to go into any sort of, I mean, the teeth is just because they should be a bit brighter. The eyes, I don't know what happened to the eyes. No one wants to know what happened to the eyes. But I want them to be brighter anyway, so I put some white in there. And then, like, if you haven't got a wet palette, give it a good think and maybe get a wet palette. I love them because now that I messed stuff up, I got whites everywhere. I can go back in with my bruised braineather azure and clean up. And that's already in my wet palette, and it's, obviously still functionable. After the white is dried, I use a shade, carroburg crimson, in the mouth and in the eyes. And I tend to not use washes or shades all that much anymore. There's a couple. I use a sepia wash, not here, don't think about sepia wash. I'm just saying that I use it quite a bit. But on things like this, like getting in the eyes, it just sort of happens naturally, and just to sort of darken the inside of the mouth and stuff like that, it's just so much easier to find to use a wash than to try and paint with the brush in there. And then next step, I wanted to sort of highlight the skin up, and I had this hellhound flesh, which is sort of like a green zombie kind of a color, but it was a little bit too bright. So I darkened it down a little bit with the original skin mixture, once again, EA wet palette. And I started highlighting whatever is supposed to be highlighted. So it's the top of the head, and all these things. And the great thing here, like, again, wet palette or whatever, but if you highlight too much, if you're taking away too much blood or bruising, you can always paint a little bit back. And when I sort of highlighted it and getting a nice idea of where the whole thing's going, I wanted to, be more bruised, and I wanted it to be a bluer bruise than this sort of purple. Oops. So I grabbed some heavy blue, which is a Vallejo model color. I diluted it to almost like an ink, or a glaze, not an ink, I meant a glaze, and went in and added extra bruising in sort of shaded areas. And after that, I could actually start highlighting with just pure hellhound flesh. And when I'd done that, it was sort of a little bit too green. I didn't want him to be as green, as more like dead. I mean, it's sort of all the blood is obviously poured out from the bottom of his head, and so it should be more sort of lifeless than rotting green. So I went in for my stone grey. This is one of my absolute favorite colors, and it's almost empty, and no one, like, the 3 stores I've been in lately, they don't have this, so I'm guessing it's sort of backlogged, whatever. But I started highlighting with this stone grey, basically. Now you can choose how far you want to sort of highlight, and obviously you can choose whatever tints and colors that you want. If you want to sort of highlight it more, you can just mix some white into the stone grey or something like that. I'm still sort of having in mind that this head is at the bottom of, like, it's on the bottom part of the miniature. It'd be really strange if the highlights were really, really bright, because I mean, basically it's hanging sort of down there in a bit of shade. So I'm taking that into consideration as well, that I don't want him to be too highlighted, basically. Now that I got this far, I was sort of feeling done, but it looked a little bit more sort of just zombie dead, and I figured, like, this bloodfest crimson that was originally thought of like the blood, it has sort of incorporated itself with all the other colors into more of a very bruised look, and I wanted a bit more of a fresh, not fresh blood, but more blood. So I went for this sanguine highlights from Formula P3, and just added more, like, where there would have been more sort of dry, so it's not really fresh but maybe dry blood. So it's down where the neck has been ripped off, and you've probably noticed I'm painting, he's got, like, the actual corpse, the rest of him is actually on the ground as well, so I've been painting that sort of simultaneously. I could sort of built it myself, which is why it looks kind of weird. It's sort of bits and pieces of green stuff, and I don't know what. It's supposed to be a spine and some skin, but that's where the head comes from. But so I sort of enhanced the bloody look a little bit. And then I showed it to my wife, actually. She was just passing. And I asked her, what do you think? And she was like, there's something missing. I think yellow is missing. And I was like, yellow? Yeah, no. But I could do blood splatter. And she was like, okay, that'll be fine. And so I've never done blood splatter before. But basically, I went back to the Bloodfest Crimson because I figured it'd be nice if it wasn't too theatrically bright. And I dipped my brush in a little bit of watered down Bloodfest Crimson from my wet palette. And, you know, as you can see, I did sort of this. And it's splattered everywhere. And I thought, wow, that was cool. I'd do it again. And then I actually managed to rub my brush up against it because it's really difficult doing this while filming at the same time. So I had to do sort of a quick clean job and then clean a little bit off the rest of the orc because he was absolutely splattered everywhere. But I left some, and that was pretty much the dead head. Afterwards, of course, I painted the hair and, you know, things like that. But we're concentrating on the head right now. As you can see, he's pretty dead looking. I really liked the sort of bruised look that I was after. I think, you know, if you're not going just for a ripped off head, working in this way could do well on other sort of zombie type characters or dead, whatever. And I guess the technique basically is working with the bruising. Like I had a pretty normal skin tone to start with, and then adding like red and purples to build up, you know, unnatural, and doing it sort of in different layers and just different strokes here and there. The only thing I'm keeping in mind is trying to keep darker colors where it's supposed to be dark, which is in my head from the Zenithal priming, and then sort of the lighter flesh tones as the highlights. And that's how I painted a ripped off head. Thanks very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and have a great day. Bye.